I'm 32-year-old Amber Wilson, and I work in Boston as a financial analyst. I feel like I've earned a modest but comfortable existence for myself after years of hard labor. I was therefore perplexed when I received mortgage documentation for a home I never purchased in the mail. Then my parents dropped the news. We've determined that you ought to cover your sister's mortgage. They actually filed a lawsuit against me and demanded $480,000 after I refused. My family and I ended up in court after the nightmare that ensued. Before I explain the origin of this nightmare, tell me from where you're viewing. Remember to subscribe as well. You might be able to avoid the same fate if you're interested in hearing more tales of family financial problems. You must be somewhat familiar with the dynamics of the Wilson family in order to comprehend how things between me and my family became so disastrously terrible. Since I can remember, my parents, Eleanor and Richard Wilson, and my younger sister, Heather, who is 4 years my junior, have lived with me in a middle-class Connecticut neighborhood. My parents' treatment of us was always unbalanced. I was supposed to be the one with everything together, the one who was responsible, and the achiever. Heather, however, was pampered, shielded, and, to be honest, spoiled. If I received a B+ on an exam, if Heather received a C, people would ask me why it wasn't an A. When she departed, my parents would rejoice and give her a lovely gift to cheer her up. There was nothing particularly dramatic or overtly abusive in our home. The subtle injustices that you don't completely comprehend until you're an adult were all over it, considering things like how I had to take part-time jobs during high school or how Heather got a car for her 16th birthday while I received an old bicycle. Heather, on the other hand, had simply to concentrate on being a teenager. In our family, I was the first to attend college, to pay for my living expenses. I worked really hard to earn a partial scholarship to Boston University, took out student loans to cover the remaining balance, and put in 20 hours a week at the school library. My parents said they had to save for Heather's future, so they gave me exactly $0 for my education. At the time, I didn't hate it. I took pride in my self-reliance and perseverance. In contrast, Heather attended 3 different universities over the course of 5 years, but never earned a degree. My parents never asked why she dropped out to find herself, always paid her tuition in full, provided for her housing, and gave her spending money. They had already spent well over $150,000 on her stalled academic endeavors by the time she was 23. When I was still making school debt payments, I got an entry-level job at a Boston financial firm after graduating from college. I shared a small apartment with 3 roommates, ate ramen noodles more often than I'd like to admit, and paid off my student loans with every dime I had left over. I had to live that way for 5 years and get a few promotions before I could afford a 1-bedroom apartment of my own. By the time I was 30, I had paid off my student loans, saved money for an emergency fund, and made contributions to my 401k. I was proud of my hard-won financial independence. Heather, meantime, worked as a waitress, store employee, and administrative assistant, never staying in one place for more than a few months at a time. Until she moved out at the age of 27, she lived in our parents' basement for free. My parents paid her security deposit and co-signed her lease. As a welcoming present, they also outfitted her apartment. There were innumerable times during our 20s when my parents expected me to provide Heather with financial support. My mother phoned me rather than a mechanic when her car broke down. She would claim you're good with money. You must have a few $100s to spare for your sister's auto maintenance. For work, she truly needs it. Or when Heather was unable to pay for a trip she wanted to take with friends. Even though her birthday was months away, my father would still call and propose that I give her a gift for her birthday. I would generally give in and remind myself that it was a one-time thing and that family helps family whenever I felt a mix of responsibility and animosity. However, it never happened once. Since I was doing well, there was an implicit assumption that I should support my sister's way of life. As I got into my 30s, family get-togethers grew more tense. When I would bring up a promotion or a minor investment I had made, my mother would start talking about how Heather was having trouble paying her rent, or how her credit card debt was causing her worry. The inference was always obvious. Since you're successful, you ought to be resolving her issues. Thanksgiving last year was really awkward. I recently received a substantial pay raise after being promoted to senior financial analyst. I made the error of bringing it up when my aunt inquired about my work situation. My father drew me aside a few minutes later to ask whether I would be interested in assisting Heather with her debt consolidation loan. He claimed that she was drowning in interest payments. It wouldn't even scratch the surface of your finances with your new job. Saying, "I need to look at my budget." I sidestepped the situation. However, I heard my mother assuring Heather, "Don't worry, we'll work something out with Amber." As we were heading out, she has no idea how ordinary people live in the real world. I was aware of the absurdity of this comment, as it came from someone who had never let my sister see the real world. I still yearned for my family's acceptance in spite of everything. I wanted them to be pleased with the results of my diligence and self-control, without the safety net they had always given my sister. I wanted them to realize that I had created something worthwhile. In my heart, I believe I was still that young girl, hoping that if I had accomplished enough, they would eventually consider me deserving of the same affection and encouragement they freely showed Heather. Even if it was misplaced, that hope was going to be destroyed in the most terrible way possible. I checked my mail after work on a typical Tuesday in April. A big packet from Massachusetts Bay Mortgage Company appeared among the regular flyers and bills, assuming that it was promotional content. Something forced me to open it even though I was about to throw it away. A full set of mortgage records for a home located at 247 Oakwood Drive in Winchester, Massachusetts, a wealthy suburb roughly 20 minutes from Boston, were contained therein. A $480,000 loan was listed with my name as the borrower. The monthly payment for a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage was determined to be $2,850. I had the impression that I was experiencing an out-of-body sensation. This was my first time applying for a mortgage. This was a property I had never ever seen. However, my signature, or what looked to be my signature, was included on a number of the documents. I called the mortgage company right away. However, it was after work. Regarding possible fraud and identity theft, I left an urgent message. Then, wondering how this could have happened, I had a restless night. My mother called the following morning before I had a chance to contact the mortgage company again. "Have you received the mortgage documents?" Casually, as though she were inquiring about a birthday card she had sent. She asked, "What's going on?" "Mom," I insisted, "my name appears on these documents for a house I have no knowledge about." "Well, we should talk about that," she remarked. "I think we should all get together for supper with your father." "Would you be able to visit us tonight? Heather will also be present." My stomach gave a nod. I must know what's going on now. "Mom, is this identity theft of some sort? Amber, stop being so dramatic." She let out a sigh. "This is a family issue. Tonight, we'll go over everything." 600. Before I could object any further, she hung up. I rarely phoned in ill to work, so I spent the day feeling confused and anxious. I took a car that night to my parents' house in Connecticut, where I had spent my childhood. My parents had assisted Heather in financing her relatively new Honda Civic 2 years prior, and it was already parked in the driveway. They were all sitting in the living room, looking eerily serene as I entered. Without asking if I wanted a glass of wine, my mother poured one for me. My father positioned me as though I were at a job interview and pointed to the armchair across from them. My father started by saying, "We know you're confused about the mortgage documents, Amber, but we've been planning this for a while. Instead of having a family meal, what exactly are you planning?" With the wine still unopened on the coffee table between us, I inquired. "As you are aware, Heather has been renting that expensive Cambridge flat." My mom added her voice. "We also believed it was time for her to own something, given the state of the housing market." I nervously said, "That's nice. However, How is that related to me? My dad cleared his throat. In Winchester, we discovered the ideal starter home. Good schools and a good neighborhood. For when she has kids in the future, handy location. My mother went on to say that Heather couldn't get a mortgage on her own because of her credit, employment history, and other factors. A chilly insight started to creep in. Thus, you make use of my data, credit, and earnings. With every question, my voice was getting louder. Now, my father stated severely, don't get irritated. We have determined that this mortgage should be paid by you. I gaped at them in shock. You made your decision without consulting me or getting my approval. My mother responded, You're doing so well in your career. As though that clarified everything. This residence is necessary for your sister, because family looks out for family. At last, Heather, who had been quiet up until now, spoke. Amber, it's not as if you can afford it. You talk about your investments and promotions all the time. You've never held down a job for more than a few months, so I'm barely able to pay my rent each month. I blew up, and without totally ruining my own financial future, even if I could afford it, which, incidentally, I cannot. Nobody has the authority to commit fraud in my name because of that. With a frown, my mother added, The word fraud is very ugly. We are related. How did you accomplish this at all, I insisted. How was my signature obtained? My banking details. Then my father shifted uneasily. Your previous tax returns from when you were living at home were still with us. What about your mom? She's always been proficient at copying autographs, though I was physically sick. Therefore, you falsified my signature on court records. Are you aware of the gravity of this situation? Identity theft is what this is. This is deception. This is illegal. Be less theatrical. Heather snorted. You're not being taken advantage of by strangers. Where is your family? A family that seems to approve of stealing my identity and putting me in debt for $500,000 without my consent. Now, unable to control my rage and incredulity, I was yelling, Reduce the volume of your voice. My dad gave me an order. The choice has been made. The house has been bought already. Next week, Heather will move in, I said, getting to my feet. The decision has not been made. I will not be making mortgage payments. And I did not consent to this. I didn't register for it. What do you say? My mom inquired. Her voice was low and threatening. No. I'm saying, not at all. I refuse to make any contributions to this mortgage. And I'm going to report this as fraud to the mortgage company and the police tomorrow, before chaos erupted. There was a moment of astonished silence. Heather sobbed as she lamented how I was destroying her life. My mother began to enumerate all the sacrifices they had made for me over the years, the most of which were wholly untrue. If I didn't do the correct thing, my father threatened to disown me. Once in your self-centered life, the appropriate action. I gave a sour laugh. Instead of encouraging Heather's dependence, it would have been better to teach her financial responsibility. Respecting me enough to at least inquire before committing a criminal in my name would have been the proper thing to do. I picked up my handbag and made my way to the door. My mother grabbed my arm and followed me. She growled, You're no longer a member of this family if you leave through that door. I gave her a direct glance. Perhaps I don't want to be a part of this family any longer if it means allowing you to ruin my financial future and breach the law. That night, as I drove home, tears were flowing down my face as I wavered between anger, betrayal, and heartbreaking loss. I had just discovered the full degree of my family's disdain for me, which I had spent my entire life attempting to win over. They didn't consider me a daughter. I had the inconveniently independent mind of an ATM. I gave my buddy Jessica, a paralegal at a law company that specializes in financial crimes, a call the morning following that terrible family meal. I described the circumstances. My voice is still trembling from shock and rage. Amber, after hearing my experience, Jessica responded. "This is serious. Your parents committed mortgage fraud and identity theft. Serious penalties apply to these federal offenses. I realize I mentioned feeling ill, but my sister would be destroyed if they were imprisoned because they are my parents. You must defend yourself financially and legally, but I'm not suggesting you have to file criminal charges right soon. You are the owner of this mortgage. Your credit score will suffer and your future may be negatively impacted if payments are not completed." Rachel Goldstein, a lawyer at Jessica's business, agreed to see me pro bono for a consultation after Jessica put me in touch with her. Rachel didn't hold back. "We must first record whatever she said. The mortgage firm, the property records office, and maybe the police must then be legally informed that this mortgage was obtained fraudulently without your consent. Will my parents end up behind bars?" Still feeling torn by their betrayal, I inquired. "Whether you decide to file criminal charges will determine that," Rachel clarified. "However, before any payments are due during the course of the following week, you must legally detach yourself from this mortgage." I compiled a timeline of events, emails and texts from my parents confessing to their actions, the falsified documents, and other supporting documentation. With Rachel's assistance, I was able to write a formal letter to my parents that was sent by certified mail and made it clear that I would not be taking on the mortgage, that I would take all necessary legal action to defend myself because I knew that fraud had been committed in my name. My father called 3 days after my letter would have been delivered to them. I let the voicemail go. "This juvenile outburst has lasted long enough. Amber." The speaker on my phone roared his voice. "Heather has been crying for days, and your mother is inconsolable. You must mature and take responsibility for your family. Give us a call right now so that we can resolve this like grown-ups." I didn't return the call. As advised by Rachel, I instead sent official notices to the county property records office and the mortgage business, along with an affidavit confirming that my signature had been falsified. Things really got out of hand at that point. To circumvent my call barring, my parents started phoning me several times a day from various numbers. When my mother arrived at work, she made a big disturbance in the foyer before being hauled out by security. My father falsely accused family members and said I was mentally ill in an email to my boss. Fortunately, my employer was supportive of me and acknowledged that this was harassment. On social media, Heather started what I can only call a smear campaign. She shared heartbreaking videos of her successful sister's spiteful attempts to put her on the streets. She posted screenshots of our text exchanges that had been altered to make me appear callous. Based on an entirely made-up account of what happened, she even made a GoFundMe page called "Abandoned by My Sister When I Needed Her Most," which raised several $1,000s. The whole family became interested. I suddenly got strong thoughts about my selfish behavior from 2 aunts, uncles, and cousins who I hadn't spoken to in years. Others barred and unfriended me on social media without even listening to my side of the story, while others sent me long messages about family loyalty. Ruth, my maternal grandma, was the only one who expressed sincere care. "There seems to be a lot going on with your sister and dad. Amber, honey, I'm available if you need to talk, but I'm not picking sides. I cherish you." I started crying when I read that one message of unwavering support. It was my family's lone lifeline that wasn't tainted by deception. The mortgage company's fraud section had started an inquiry in the interim, but they cautioned me that it might take months to finish. Citing the ongoing inquiry, they refused to confirm what steps they might take against my parents. My entire life started to suffer as a result of the stress. I struggled to fall asleep and frequently woke up from nightmares about homelessness or being imprisoned for debts I had not incurred. My manager became concerned after I started performing poorly at work. Other than going to work and returning home to eagerly stare at my inbox for anything from Rachel or the mortgage company, I stopped going to my weekly yoga class, seeing friends, and doing pretty much anything else. The ultimatum followed. I was completely chilled by the voicemail my father left. "Amber, this is the last warning you will receive. Our lawyer has been advised by your mother and me. We will be suing you for the entire cost of the house if you don't drop your fraud allegations and accept responsibility for your sister's mortgage by the end of this week. We have decades of proof of verbal agreements and family obligations that any judge will acknowledge. Even if you believe your fancy Boston lawyer is clever, don't put us to the test. Rachel phoned me within minutes after I forwarded the voicemail to her right away. She assured me that they were bluffing. Family pledges aren't legally binding contracts, and there are no enforceable verbal agreements regarding taking on someone else's $500,000 mortgage. Therefore, I should disregard the threat. I paused before asking Rachel, "Not precisely. It's frivolous or not. Should they bring a lawsuit, you will have to answer. Additionally, defending yourself even against anonymous accusations can be costly and taxing. What ought I to do? Keep recording everything. Avoid interacting with them directly. Additionally, Amber, you might want to think about requesting a restraining order. In light of the growing harassment, an order of restraining me from my own parents." I chuckled to spite myself since the suggestion was so unbelievable. But as soon as the full force of the situation hit me once more, the amusement swiftly turned to tears. How did this happen? How could those I required legal protection from turn out to be the ones who were meant to love and care for me? I received litigation paperwork at my flat for days after that. Yes, I was being sued for $480,000 by my parents. The entire cost of the house they had deceitfully bought in my name. They claimed that I had broken a family agreement, that they had acted as my agents in good faith, and that I had orally agreed to buy a house for my sister. Their legal action was a masterwork of manipulation and history distortion. Regardless of how unfounded their allegations were, I was now facing a real lawsuit that might deplete my money, harm my image in the workplace, and continue on for months or years. It was ridiculous, frustrating, and terrifying all at once. I was at my lowest that night while sitting on my couch with legal paperwork all over me. I was all alone. In addition to betraying me, the family I had spent my entire life striving to please was now actively attempting to undermine the freedom I had laboriously built for the first time. I gave myself permission to consider whether it would be better for me to simply give up on paying the mortgage, attempting to preserve what was left of my familial ties while accepting the financial setback. However, as the idea developed, a wave of insight pierced the emotional haze. No, money was no longer the issue. This was about resisting decades of unfair treatment and manipulation. This was about refusing to allow those who ought to have abused you financially, my staunchest advocates. I grabbed my cell and dialed Rachel. When she responded, I continued, "They're actually suing me. And I'm determined to fight this until the end." Wilson and Wilson versus Wilson. The formal title of the case my parents filed against me was a heartbreakingly ironic depiction of how family had turned against family. The 37-page complaint contained numerous accusations ranging from familial fraud to unjust enrichment to verbal contract violations. The last one isn't even a legitimate legal idea. After looking it over, Rachel verified her suspicions. The main goal of the legally weak lawsuit was to scare me into complying. Faint or not, I still had to give a formal response within 21 days or face being hit with a default judgment. "I can assist with the first response," Rachel said. "However, you truly need a litigation lawyer who focuses on family money issues for a case this complicated." The issue was that, for someone like myself who makes a respectable but modest wage, litigation lawyers are prohibitively expensive. After speaking with 3 different attorneys, I ultimately decided on Marcus Bennett, who had a solid reputation for handling cases involving financial abuse of families. After Rachel gave me a number of recommendations, his retainer was $10,000, which was nearly all of the money I had accumulated for my emergency fund over the course of years of meticulous planning. "At our first formal encounter," Marcus said, "I'll be honest with you, Miss Wilson, there is absolutely no legal validity to this case. If you didn't agree to a mortgage, especially one that was secured through fraudulent documents, your parents have no right to make you pay for it." "Isn't that good news?" I inquired. "Both yes and no. The good news is that we ought to prevail in the end. The bad news is that it can end up being a costly and drawn-out process. It seems like your parents are trying to deplete you emotionally and financially until you give up and settle. Marcus assisted me in submitting a thorough response to the complaint, refuting all of the accusations and stating my own harassment counterclaims. Intentional emotional anguish and defamation stemming from my family's untrue public remarks against me. Additionally, we submitted a move to dismiss the matter completely, claiming that their claims lacked legal support. The legal system, however, operates slowly, as Marcus had cautioned. 3 months prior, Caroline Reeves, the judge assigned to our case, scheduled a hearing for the petition to dismiss. Meanwhile, my life kept falling apart. My credit score and my capacity to make any other significant financial decisions were already being impacted by the fact that the mortgage was still nominally in my name while the mortgage company's fraud investigation was ongoing. In fact, my sister Heather had moved into the house at the heart of the argument. She shared smug pictures of her new house on Instagram with the captions, "So blessed and dreams do come true." When you are loved by others, it seemed like a calculated twist of the knife with each post. Between the legal retainer, continuing legal bills, and the time I had to miss work for depositions and sessions with Marcus, the financial burden grew more intense. I was using down my savings quite quickly. I had to cease making contributions to my 401k and cancel a planned vacation. I also had to start using credit cards for everyday purchases like groceries, something I had proudly avoided since my post-college days. Even worse was the emotional toll. Food intolerance caused me to lose 10 pounds in a month. Stress caused my hair to start falling out in bunches. Convinced that I was drowning in unseen debt, I experienced panic attacks in the middle of the night and woke up gasping for oxygen. My few surviving friends made an effort to offer assistance, but it was obvious that they were confused by the circumstances. "Just figure this out, will you?" they would inquire. After all, they are your family, or worse. If you have the money, you might want to think about helping your sister. Family endures forever. These well-meaning but ignorant remarks simply made me feel more alone. Nobody seemed to comprehend the basic infraction that had taken place, how my own parents had used my financial obligation as a weapon against me, how they had actually committed crimes in my name, and how they were now attempting to use the law to coerce me into supporting my adult sister's lifestyle. Even my therapist, whom I began seeing once a week to deal with the anxiety, appeared to imply in a subtle way that maybe a compromise might be reached. Winning the battle can sometimes mean losing the war in family disputes. In one session, she said, "What would it mean to you to maintain these connections, even if it meant paying a price?" After that session, I never went back to her practice. I didn't need another person to tell me that I should put my financial security at risk in order to appease my poisonous family. The complaint is 3 months old. Marcus received a settlement offer from my parents' lawyer. If Heather could qualify by then and my parents would drop the lawsuit, I would take over the mortgage payments for 5 years, following which the house would be refinanced in her name. Marcus asked me what I wanted to accomplish and then made the offer without making any recommendations. I sat in his office with a flurry of emotions swirling inside of me as I stared at the settlement document. To put an end to the horror, a part of me, the worn-out, financially strapped, and emotionally spent part, was inclined to accept. Making mortgage payments for 5 years would be debilitating but not disastrous. I might become better. But then I considered the true meaning of acceptance. It would indicate that my parents' strategies had been successful. It would imply that it was a successful tactic to forge my signature, take my identity, and then sue me when I objected. It would entail committing to 5 more years of financial manipulation and control. "No," I finally answered, sounding more forceful than I had in months. "I refuse to compromise. Not for 5 years. Not for 5 months, not for 5 minutes. They did something bad, and I will not justify it by caving in now." With a tinge of approval on his face, Marcus nodded. "I'll give an answer, Miss Wilson, too. In light of its value, I believe you're making the correct decision. I was at my lowest the night before our court date for the request to dismiss. I was sitting by myself in my flat, surrounded by court filings, unpaid invoices, and the remains of an unfinished meal. I totally lost it. I cried till I was gasping for air. I let out great, heaving cries that seemed to originate from my innermost being. The young girl who had always worked so hard to gain her parents' favor made me cry. I wept for the young lady who had supported herself while attending college. I wept for the grown woman who had established a financially responsible life, only to have it jeopardized by those who ought to have been most proud of her accomplishments. And I sensed a change in myself when the tears eventually stopped. There was still grief, but it was accompanied by a steely resolution. I wouldn't let this break me. I wouldn't allow them to prevail. I would approach tomorrow's court proceedings with the same tenacity that got me through every other obstacle in my life. Whatever it takes, I'm ready for tomorrow, I texted Marcus. He answered in a flash. Take a nap. I'll meet you at 8:30 a.m. in the courthouse. Amber. 2. You underestimate your strength. I slept through the night without having any nightmares for the first time in months. The county courthouse was a massive stone structure that appeared to be meant to frighten. I was 15 minutes ahead of schedule, arriving at 8:15 a.m. Wearing low heels and my most polished navy blue suit, with a confident gait and a briefcase in hand, Marcus greeted me on the steps of the courthouse. As we passed through the security gate, he remarked, I remember. Although Judge Reeves is known for her thoroughness and fairness, she does not accept emotional pleas in lieu of sound legal reasons. Let me speak. Unless she speaks to you directly, a number of other cases were scheduled before ours, so we were taken to courtroom 4B. I noticed that Heather and my parents were seated on the other side of the gallery. The three of them wore conventional attire that exuded respect for a family. My mom was holding a handkerchief, as though she was preparing to wipe away dramatic tears. I had understood since I was a child that my father wanted total obedience, and he sat stiffly straight with his teeth clenched. Heather kept her eyes down, but when she thought I wasn't looking, I saw her give me a cruel look. Lawrence Peterson, their lawyer, was a silver-haired man with a fancy suit who radiated arrogant assurance. He gave Marcus a brief nod, but he made no attempt to recognize me. Judge Caroline Reeves entered the court after the bailiff called it to order at exactly 9 a.m. She was a black woman in her late 50s, with smart eyes behind fashionable glasses and close-cropped gray hair. She worked quickly but methodically through the preliminary cases, giving each case her whole focus before going on to the next. The bailiff ultimately called Wilson and Wilson versus Wilson at 10:45 a.m. As Marcus and I made our way to the plaintiff's table and my parents and lawyer Peterson sat down at the defense table, my stomach knotted. Here we are, Judge Reeves said, glancing down at the file in front of her. On the defendant's motion to dismiss. I've looked over the grievance, the response, and all corroborating documentation. Bennett, an attorney, is the moving party. You can start. Marcus buttoned his jacket and stood up. Your Honor, thank you. Since there is no legitimate legal claim made in this case that could support relief, it should be dismissed with prejudice. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, the plaintiffs, are trying to enforce a verbal agreement that never existed that stated that their daughter, my client Amber Wilson, would cover the mortgage on a home they bought for their other daughter, Heather Wilson. He went on to systematically dismantle every allegation in my parents' lawsuit, pointing out that my parents had acknowledged in writing that they had forged my signature on mortgage documents and that there was no proof that verbal agreements for real estate transactions were unenforceable under the statute of frauds. A crime at the federal level? Additionally, Your Honor, Marcus added, we have submitted a counterclaim for the harm done to Mrs. Wilson's financial standing and credit score by the fake mortgage, as well as for the mental distress brought on by this harassment campaign. Judge Reeves paid close attention, taking notes here and there. When Marcus was done, she turned to the plaintiff's attorney. Peterson, your answer. With a flourish, Peterson stood up. This issue, Your Honor, is essentially about implied contracts and familial duties that are specific to the context of family relationships. In exchange, the Wilsons reared their daughter, paid for her schooling, and encouraged her to pursue her professional goals. There was an agreement that Amber would help her sister when she needed it. I had to hold back from telling them that my parents had not helped me with my education and that any knowledge they had had was only a product of their own ideas. I needed all the restraint I could muster, but Marcus had told me to keep a neutral face no matter what was said. Peterson went on with a tragic tone in his voice. The Wilsons secured this mortgage on behalf of their daughter, sincerely thinking that she had committed to assisting her sister in realizing the American ideal of owning a home. Mrs. Wilson only broke this family promise after the acquisition was finalized, which forced her parents to take legal action. Although Judge Reeves's face stayed neutral, her subsequent inquiry betrayed doubt. Are you saying, counselor, that because of an assumed familial connection, parents have the inherent legal right to falsify their adult child's signature on mortgage documents? Peterson stumbled a little. Not precisely in those words, Your Honor, but in the framework of this particular familial dynamic. We must be clear. Judge Reeves stepped in. The complaint admits that Miss Wilson was not physically present when her signature was appended to these documents. Do the plaintiffs deny that this took place? Peterson acknowledged, Your Honor, that they are not contesting the signature problem. However, they insisted that prior family financial arrangements gave them implied permission to act on her behalf. Judge Reeves's eyebrow went up. Mr. Wilson, I would like to speak with the plaintiffs directly about this. Come on over. My dad got up and came over to the witness stand to take his oath. His testimony was a masterclass in manipulating emotions and revising history. We have always been a close-knit family that supports one another. Your Honor? His voice was warm and fatherly as he started. While Amber's career was taking off, we were ecstatic. Our family beliefs naturally led us to believe that she would want to assist her sister, who hasn't had as much luck. Before you finished these forms, Wilson, did you expressly ask us if she would take out a $480,000 mortgage for her sister? Judge Reeves inquired. My father hesitated. Well, not exactly in those words. However, we've discussed Heather's housing predicament and Amber's duty to assist as the successful sibling on numerous occasions over the years. Therefore, the answer is no. You didn't specifically ask, and she didn't specifically agree. Judge Reeves said bluntly, My father claimed that it was understood. I am aware that you are under oath, Mr. Wilson. Did you or did you not forge your daughter's signature on these mortgage documents? Judge Reeves went on. Then my father shifted uneasily. The word forge is not one I would use. Since we sincerely thought Amber would want to assist her sister, Your Honor, my wife signed on her behalf. The face tightened on Judge Reeves. Forgery is defined as Mr. Wilson signing someone else's name without that person's express consent. Whether the individual is a total stranger or your daughter is irrelevant. The next person phoned was my mother, who gave a heartfelt performance about how I had neglected my family duties and how their actions were motivated solely by a desperate attempt to save Heather's life. Heather then gave her own account, portraying herself as the victim of my egotistical success and financial bullying. Marcus occasionally objected during their testimony when their remarks deviated into hearsay or unsupported assertions, the majority of which Judge Reeves upheld. I was called upon to testify. I inhaled deeply and told myself to keep my mouth shut. I described how I had supported myself through college without my parents' help, how years of meticulous preparation and sacrifice had allowed me to become financially stable, and how I had never once agreed to take out a mortgage for my sister. In the past, have your parents ever made financial decisions for you without your permission? Unless Wilson, Judge Reeves inquired. Yes, Your Honor, I said, and went on to describe a number of lesser incidents throughout the years. Applications for credit cards were filed under my name. co-signing a loan I had not consented to tax returns being prepared on my behalf without my consent. And did you bring up these occurrences with them? I did, Your Honor. Each time they waved away my worries, claiming that I was being overly formal about financial problems and that it was just family assisting family. Peterson attempted to paint me as aloof and heartless during cross-examination, posing difficult queries such as, would it have been so difficult to assist your sister in need when you're doing so well financially? Isn't it true that you've continuously prioritized your own financial interests over your sister's welfare? Most of these queries were deemed contentious by Marcus, and Judge Reeves upheld the objections, telling Peterson from time to time to limit his questions to those that were legally pertinent. During the last part of the hearing, Marcus presented a number of emails and texts between my parents that I had only recently learned about through the legal discovery process. This was the most damaging evidence. Amber would never consent to this, according to a letter my father wrote to my mother. It would be preferable to proceed and present it as a fait accompli if we ask directly. Her independence has always been too much for her own good. Once the paperwork is signed and Heather moves in, my mother had responded in another, what is there for her to do? She refuses to allow her sister to end up destitute, regardless of how much she gripes. Their evidence on implied authority and familial understanding was directly refuted by these messages, which also demonstrated the deliberate nature of their activities. Judge Reeves glanced over the rim of her glasses at each party as the session came to an end. I'll consider this case and make a decision in 10 days. But I want to make one thing extremely clear. No matter how close they are, family ties cannot take precedence over fundamental legal rules regarding identity theft and consent contracts. The court has been adjourned. I briefly caught my mother's attention across the courtroom as we collected our documents. I caught a glimpse of doubt, perhaps even remorse, in her face. But as she looked away, the old mask of righteous wrath swiftly took its place. As we left the courthouse, Marcus told me, "You did good." Those text messages were quite persuasive, and the judge appeared open to hearing our arguments. However, winning a case in a family rarely feels good. Are you ready for that? Slowly, I nodded. I believe I came to a significant realization today. The money was never really the point of this. It has to do with respect or the absence of it. As a self-sufficient adult with the freedom to make my own decisions, they have never appreciated me. Marcus then inquired, regardless of the judge's decision, I must now respect myself enough to maintain that line. I experienced an unanticipated sense of peace as we said our goodbyes on the courthouse steps. Even if the verdict was still up in the air, I had told the truth to myself, my family, and the court. What came next? No one could take that victory away from me. At least, Marcus texted me to let me know that the ruling was in 9 days after the hearing, when I was in a budget meeting at work. When you can, give me a call. I excused myself and went into the corridor, my heart racing. Marcus picked up the phone on the first ring. Judge Reeves stated without preface that the case was dismissed with prejudice. Additionally, she approved our request to penalize her parents and their lawyer for bringing a baseless lawsuit. I felt abruptly weak and leaned against the wall. What does that mean exactly? It has multiple meanings. To begin with, the case is dead. They are unable to refile it or make these allegations once more. Second, as a punishment for misusing the legal system, they will be required to pay a percentage of your legal fees. Third, if the mortgage company or prosecutors choose to pursue the fraud aspect, the judge's strongly worded judgments against their actions may be pertinent. I closed my eyes as waves of relief swept over me. Although it won't cover everything, the $15,000 she gave for my legal bills would undoubtedly be helpful. But there's more. Additionally, the judge issued a temporary restraining order that forbids her sister or parents from getting in touch with you personally for the next 90 days. She brought up the history of intimidation and harassment. Rachel had proposed a restraining order months prior, but I hadn't even requested one during the hearing. Clearly, Judge Reeves had seen enough of the evidence to conclude that it was required. Marcus added. There's one more thing. In light of the mortgage fraud, Judge Reeves referred the case to the district attorney's office for possible criminal investigation. It does not imply that charges will be brought. The DNA has complete control over that. However, the prospect is now open. There was more nuance to this story. The fact that the justice system acknowledged the seriousness of my parents' actions made me feel somewhat vindicated. The idea of their being charged with a crime still made another portion shudder. What happens to the mortgage and the house? I inquired. Your fraud lawsuit with the mortgage company should be resolved as a result of the judge's order to formally notify them of her findings. Regarding the house itself, the mortgage company, your sister, and your parents are all involved. Legally speaking, you are now totally divorced from it. I spent a few minutes sitting in the office staircase after I hung up, trying to understand the conflicting emotions of relief, vindication, loss, and residual rage that were churning inside of me. Even though I had triumphed categorically and totally, victory didn't feel like what I had anticipated. The verdict was swiftly publicized. Judge rules against parents who forged daughter's signature on mortgage was the headline in the online version of the Boston Globe by that evening, indicating that it had somehow made its way to local media. Citing court records and Marcus's statement regarding the significance of upholding financial limits even within families, the piece was succinct but accurate. That evening, unable to handle the inevitable flurry of responses, I shut off my phone. I had 47 missed calls, more than 100 text messages, and innumerable social media notifications when I turned it back on the following morning. Some were from reporters who wanted to remark. Many came from members of the extended family. Some are shocked and supportive. Others are criticizing me for pursuing legal action in family concerns. Many were from former acquaintances who had originally supported my sister but were now clumsily trying to get back in touch. But my sister's voicemail was the most startling. And at 2:13 a.m., Heather was gone. Evidently drunk, she mumbled. I hope you're happy now. Since the verdict, Mom has experienced 2 panic attacks. The bank is foreclosing, and I have 30 days to leave my house. And Dad is considering filing for bankruptcy. Amber, you have ruined this family. Even though I always knew you were self-centered, I never imagined you would get this far. You no longer have a family, so I hope your valuable money keeps you warm at night. I listened to the message once and then erased it, choosing not to allow it to control my feelings. My parents, not me, were responsible for whatever occurred with the house. I had no control over their interpretation of what happened or whether they ever took responsibility. My father's brother, Uncle Paul, who had cut ties with the family years prior for reasons I'd never completely comprehended, sent me an unexpected email 3 days after the decision. I've been keeping up with your parents' situation and the mortgage issue. Amber, I want you to know how proud I am of you for sticking to your principles. They did similar things to me in the 1990s as they did to you. This family has a pattern that dates back many generations. I'm sorry you had to endure this by yourself. I'm available if you ever want to talk. His email filled in a gap in the jigsaw. Neither Heather nor I were the only ones involved in this. It dealt with a long-standing family dynamic of financial exploitation that was passed off as family support. I had a strange sense of comfort knowing that I wasn't the only one who had experienced it and that Uncle Paul had survived and prospered after establishing boundaries. The mortgage firm officially wrapped up their fraud investigation a week later, and I received official papers stating that my name had been deleted from all property-related records and that my credit report would be updated. They informed me that I was totally exempt from any liability, but they were still exploring their own legal options against my parents. As expected, the media interest was short-lived. My narrative wasn't exciting enough to last, but it was unique enough to make the local headlines. The items vanished from the front pages after 2 weeks, to be replaced by more recent controversies and human interest pieces. The personal reverberations, however, did not diminish as rapidly. After reading the judge's decision, members of my extended family who had previously denounced me began to reach out, providing a belated but empty show of solidarity. I knew that restoring trust would take time, if it ever happened, so I answered to most of them in a kind but aloof manner. The social media accounts of my sister experienced a significant change. The arrogant pictures of her home had vanished, and in their place were ambiguous, motivational sayings about conquering hardship and poisonous people. Although she never brought up me or the case directly, everyone who knew the circumstances could see that she was making passive-aggressive references. Mutual acquaintances claimed that Heather returned to my parents' basement while they requested leniency from the mortgage firm. The Winchester home was deserted, a tangible representation of the results of their deeds. About a month following the decision, my mother made one effort to reach me using a different phone number that got past my blocking. Her voicemail sounded strained and short. "Amber, all of this has gone too far. As a family, we must discuss and come up with a solution. Give me a call back. I didn't." The most surprising result was a formal letter from the district attorney's office 6 weeks following the court decision. After reviewing Judge Reeves's referral, they determined not to seek criminal charges against my parents, citing the civil remedies that were already in place and my lack of interest in doing so. The letter ended by noting that if new information became available or if I had second thoughts about going to court, the decision may be reviewed. This news was a huge comfort to me. At the same time, I had to safeguard my finances and legal rights. I had never wished for my parents to be prosecuted. What I needed, a fresh start from the fraudulent mortgage and official acknowledgement that their actions were wrong, had been achieved by the civil verdict. After the immediate shock subsided, I concentrated on reestablishing my financial stability. Although I had still spent a lot more money defending myself, the $15,000 plus granted legal fees helped defray some of my expenses. I restarted making contributions to my retirement accounts, made a new budget, and began replenishing my emergency fund. More significantly, I started to reestablish my emotional health. I discovered a new therapist who focused on financial abuse and family estrangement, someone who confirmed what I had experienced. Rather than making every effort to achieve reconciliation, I gradually broadened my social network to include people who valued healthy relationships and limits, and I reconnected with those who had supported me. I got a surprise box at my flat 6 months after the decision. I recognized the small wooden box inside as a jewelry box my grandfather had built for me when I was a child, and it had always been at my parents' house. It came with a short note written by my grandmother. "Ruth, love, this belongs with you. Grandma. Always." When I contacted her that night, she told my parents about her own complex past for the first time. She whispered softly, "Your mother has always played favorites. She also did that with her sisters. When you were younger, I ought to have intervened more." However, it's usually easier to see things in retrospect, instead of the performative family peace that had long concealed dysfunction. That talk with Grandma Ruth marked the start of a new connection between us, one built on respect for one another and open communication. After 6 months, I came to a significant realization. I felt lighter than I had in years, despite the pain and financial burden of the litigation. For maybe the first time in my adult life, the tiresome effort of attempting to gain acceptance that would never come had stopped, as had the persistent dread of anticipating the next irrational family demand. I was emotionally as well as financially independent. By that time, the media attention had completely vanished, but every now and then I would get a message from a complete stranger who had learned about my case from personal networks or legal circles. I was able to establish limits with my own financially abusive parents because, to your experience, thank you for standing up for what was right so openly. One woman wrote, "These messages served as a reminder that advocating for myself had involved more than just a mortgage or money. It also involved dispelling the myth that financial abuses by family members are acceptable. A story that ensnares far too many individuals in abusive cycles that pass for love." Through the family rumor, I never again heard directly from my parents. I found out that they were moving to a smaller house and that they had in fact filed for bankruptcy. Depending on who was telling the story, Heather's life was changing for the better, but it seemed like she had obtained a position as an administrative assistant. I had no illusions about reconciliation, but I do wish them well from a distance. After being torched, some bridges cannot and should not be restored. There are some relationships that are better off without them than with them. About 8 months after the court decision, on a cool fall day, I was having coffee with my friend Jessica, the paralegal who had initially guided me through the legal system. I hesitated when she asked a question. Do you ever feel bad about it? Considering what it cost you. I mean, standing your ground? As I watched the steam rising from my coffee cup, I gave the question significant thought. No, I responded at last. It was really expensive for me. On an emotional level, I even believed some relationships to be strong. But more importantly, it taught me that I can defend myself, that my limits are important, and that I don't have to burn myself alive to keep others warm. Jessica gave a nod. I get it. That's more valuable to her than a Winchester home. Yes, I grinned. It serves as the cornerstone for constructing something superior. I found myself seated in a little Cambridge cafe across from a young woman named Rachel a year after Judge Reeves rejected my parents' lawsuit. She made me painfully think of myself from 18 months prior. She had a packet of bank statements in her hand. Stress and fatigue ringed her eyes. She said, her voice shaking, that my parents had taken out a car loan in my name. They claim that since they reared me, it is my responsibility to assist them, yet I am still repaying my student debts and find it difficult to pay my own rent. After joining a Survivors of Family Financial Abuse online support group 6 months prior as part of my personal healing process, I eventually became a moderator for the group, where I met Rachel. This was our first face-to-face encounter. A step away from the online chats that had brought us together, I started by gently telling her that she wasn't alone in this. No matter how they try to justify it, what they're doing is not normal nor appropriate. I considered how far I had gone in my own recovery journey as I guided her through her alternatives, which included formal fraud reports, credit freezes, and possible legal remedies. The lawsuit's immediate aftermath had been harsh. I had felt a great deal of pain in spite of the legal victory, not just for the family I had lost, but also for the family I had never had. I had to face the fact that my parents and sister had always seen me more as a resource than as a human being with needs and boundaries, shattering the idealized vision of them that I had held onto for so long. I had vacillated between overpowering emotion and numbing detachment throughout those initial months. I would go through the motions of work and basic self-care for days on end, feeling nothing productive, only to be caught off guard by waves of anger or grief that left me gasping. A family picture on a coworker's desk, a song playing on the radio, a casual reference to a person's plans to spend the weekend with their parents. A downward cycle of mourning could be set off by any of these. I had received invaluable assistance in navigating this emotional landscape from my therapist, Dr. Lena Martinez. She clarified during one especially challenging session that you're not only mourning the loss of your family ties as they were, you're mourning the childhood you deserved but didn't receive, as well as the loss of the fantasy of what those relationships may have been. It was a revelatory framing. In addition to acknowledging that what I was losing had mostly been an illusion, it allowed me to accept the magnitude of my loss. I had made up a tale to help me cope with the dysfunction in my home. Additionally, therapy assisted me in unraveling the intricate web of obligation, guilt, and misplaced responsibility that had been weaved across my familial ties. I realized how my parents had instilled in me from an early age the belief that my sister's needs should come first and my own needs should be seen as selfish. According to Dr. Martinez, financial abuse is especially pernicious because money is so closely linked to survival, security, and, in many families, displays of affection. This created a situation where any boundaries I set were interpreted as an assault on family unity. Not only is your bank account being targeted when someone manipulates your finances, but your sense of security is also being undermined. This realization had enabled me to reinterpret my experience as a necessary act of self-defense against individuals who had consistently shown that they did not have my best interests at heart, rather than as a trivial disagreement over money. Alongside this emotional therapy, my life had been practically rebuilt. I was promoted from senior financial analyst to team leader at work 6 months following the litigation, and my pay increased significantly. I didn't miss the irony. Recognizing and combating the financial abuse in my personal life had been made possible by my professional financial skills. In addition, I had made a significant move from my one-bedroom apartment to a bright 2-bedroom condo that I had bought with a well-planned mortgage that felt liberating rather than confining. The second bedroom was converted into a guest room and home office, signifying my growth as a professional and my willingness to enter into new, healthier connections. My social circle had changed in a similar way. However, several friendships had suffered as a result of the family dispute. People who were uncomfortable with the messy truth of family estrangement, or who didn't understand why I was so harsh with my parents. Other connections had grown stronger. One of my closest confidants was Jessica, my paralegal friend who had initially put me in touch with legal assistance. My coworker Mark had gone from being a work friend to a true friend after filling in for me during my many absences due to court without hesitation or criticism. The most unexpected thing was that I had become close to my father's estranged brother, Uncle Paul. Our first email correspondence had developed into frequent phone conversations and, subsequently, in-person meetings. He helped me realize that what had transpired wasn't personal and gave me insight into the intergenerational patterns of money exploitation in my father's family. Rather than rejecting me specifically, my parents were reenacting a destructive pattern. During one of our talks, Uncle Paul indicated that your grandfather had attempted to harm you in the same way that he had done your father. The distinction is that your father gave in, joined the system, and then helped to maintain it. The cycle was broken by you. My recovery depended heavily on the framing that I had broken a cycle rather than a family. It changed my experience from one of a personal inability to keep the peace in the family to one of bravely refusing to allow dysfunction to continue. Making connections with other survivors of financial abuse in the family was another unanticipated avenue of healing. Originally a place to exchange resources and guidance, the online support group where I met Rachel developed into a community that offered the unwavering understanding and support that had been so noticeably lacking in my biological family. I discovered my voice as an advocate in that community. I started telling my story more publicly, first in the group under an alias, then on a blog using my real name, and then at financial literacy programs where I occasionally gave speeches. Every time I expressed my experience, it became less powerful to harm me and more capable of maybe assisting others. I was inspired to examine my credit report by your story. I discovered 3 accounts that I never opened. One group member wrote, "If you hadn't told me what happened, I wouldn't have looked." Such messages reaffirmed the possibility that my suffering could lead to something significant. That the limits I had worked so hard to set may provide a safe haven for anyone dealing with comparable infractions. Not just for me. My sister, Heather, sent me an unexpected email about a year after the case was filed. This message was quiet and hesitant, in contrast to her earlier correspondence, which had been rife with entitlement and blame. "I've been thinking a lot," she wrote. "I'm not yet ready to declare that I agree with all of your decisions or that I understand everything that happened. But I've begun to notice some trends in the way my parents treat me. That got me thinking about what you wanted us to know. I currently see a therapist. I wanted to let you know, but I don't expect a response." I talked to Dr. Martinez for days before deciding whether or not to respond. After accepting her message and wishing her well in her therapy journey, I responded a succinct, caring, yet firm response that did not immediately offer a reconciliation. It would take time, personal development, and a fundamental shift in dynamics rather than a quick papering over of profound wounds for Heather and I to heal, if at all. My parents had stopped communicating with me, except for family rumors that periodically came to me through distant relatives. I was aware that my father had been forced to postpone his retirement plans and that they had downsized to a condominium following their bankruptcy. Although their financial struggles did not satisfy me, I also understood that they were suffering from the inevitable results of their own decisions rather than as a result of penalties I had meted out to them. In terms of my personal financial recovery, it had gone more slowly but steadily than I had anticipated. My funds had been exhausted by the legal bills, but I was able to replenish my emergency fund in less than 10 months thanks to my new, higher pay. Together with a financial advisor, I developed even more robust safeguards for my assets, such as identity theft monitoring services, frequent credit freezes, and a thorough estate plan that clearly stated my desires with regard to financial matters. What if I get incapacitated? Financial trauma has been transformed into financial empowerment by you. During our yearly review, my advisor made a comment, "That is outstanding and uncommon." As I sat across from Rachel in that Cambridge cafe, I saw in her the same blend of hope, passion, and fear-driven terror that had gotten me through my own ordeal. Her posture gradually changed from hunched defensiveness to something more upright and determined as she took notes and asked questions. What if I never get their forgiveness? The question that had been bothering me for months was finally asked by her. I said, "That's the hardest part." But after a while, I understood that I was posing the incorrect query. Whether they will forgive you for defending yourself isn't the true question. If you don't, it's a question of whether you'll forgive yourself. Slowly, with comprehension emerging in her eyes, Rachel nodded. Rachel. She gathered her paperwork with a new purpose and stated, "I think I need to make some calls." I gave her my card as we were leaving. "You're not alone in this, regardless of what you decide. Both the gang and I are present." After that, as I made my way back to my condo, I thought back on the odd, agonizing, yet ultimately freeing experience of the previous 18 months. I no longer had the family I had spent 32 years trying so hard to satisfy. And at quiet times, that loss still hurt. However, something maybe more valuable had grown in their stead: unwavering faith in my own judgment, a chosen family-style group based on respect for one another rather than duty, and the understanding that, despite the individuals I had been raised to sacrifice my boundaries for, I was strong enough to defend them. When my parents tried to use the lawsuit as a means of control to get me to pay for a house for my sister, it ended up being the impetus for my total freedom from their financial and emotional manipulation. They had unintentionally encouraged me to construct something much more worthwhile for myself: a life characterized by genuine relationships, well-defined boundaries, and the serene assurance that results from surviving a storm and emerging unscathed. My phone rang with a message from the moderators of the support group as I arrived at my building. An additional new member had joined, giving a story that was eerily similar to Rachel's and my own. I stopped outside my house and wrote a kind greeting. Each person who had the guts to refuse further could be the first to end the cycle of financial exploitation that has harmed so many families, lessened its influence on upcoming generations. Perhaps the most important lesson I learned from my trip was that often the greatest loving legacy we can leave is not material aid or financial support, but rather setting an example of healthy boundaries and having the guts to uphold them even at great personal expense. Have you ever had to establish tough limits with family members on money matters? Please share your experiences in the space provided below. For more true tales on resolving complicated family dynamics, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if my story spoke to you. Keep in mind that safeguarding your financial security is not selfish. Taking care of oneself is crucial. I appreciate you listening, and I hope my story gives you the strength to respect your own boundaries, no matter what they may be.